Good morning. My name is Kate Slevin, and I'm the Executive Vice President of Regional Plan Association. On behalf of RPA, I want to welcome all of you to the release of our latest report, Homes on Track, Connecticut, Part 2, Building Thriving Communities Around Transit. For over 100 years, RPA has been the leading research, planning, and advocacy organization in the New York, Connecticut, New Jersey tri-state area, mapping out a positive vision for our region to be more prosperous, equitable, and sustainable. We do this by publishing once a generation a regional plan that outlines goals to achieve this vision. Our fourth regional plan was published in 2017 and serves as the basis for how we determine our priorities as an organization. That includes our regional focus on promoting transit-oriented communities. Our region has a housing crisis, and we want to create new homes in places where people are more likely to be able to live with a lower carbon footprint and support vibrant downtowns and main streets. In other words, we want more homes around transit. In 2024, we published part one of this series, focusing on the opportunities around rapid transit stations in New Jersey and New York, and we are excited to be following up today with our analysis of Connecticut's 63 rail and rapid bus stations. I'll now turn it over to our Connecticut Director, Pete Harrison, to take it from here. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks, Kate. Welcome, everybody. Appreciate you all being here on this very rainy day, I imagine, across the region. As Connecticut's state, regional, and local governments look to implement Public Act 25-1 in the months and years ahead, we hope the following report offers the public, planners, and elected officials a helpful reference point for how to support the type of smart growth we all want to see in our towns and cities. In addition to being a follow-up to our Part 1 regional analysis of transit-oriented opportunities, this is also a deeper dive into our earlier TOC report for Connecticut released during YIMBYtown in September 2025. That report outlined just how important transit-oriented communities are to our state's economic and environmental goals. Just as a quick refresher, about 9% of our land in Connecticut is within a half mile of a rail station or quarter mile of a bus station. That represents nearly 50% of households and 2/3 of our state's jobs. If we are ambitious, creative, and collaborative as a state, we can leverage this land to grow our economy, increase our social mobility, and lower our carbon emissions. Today, Phoebe Allen, the ProHomes Connecticut Policy Director, will go through this report to draw out key findings, and then we'll have a discussion with Phoebe, Marcel Negret, our Land Use Director, and Nick Cantor, our ProHomes Connecticut Program Director, to talk about what we want to accomplish with this report with many of you on this call. Finally, we will have opportunities for questions from the audience at the end. So if you do have a question, throw it in the chat or save it for the Q&A. I will now turn it over to Phoebe to take us through the report.
Thanks, Pete. All right, I'm going to get us all set up. Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us. Like Pete mentioned, my name is Phoebe Allen. I'm the Policy Director here at ProHomes Connecticut, and I'm really excited to be here with all of you to talk through the details of our latest report, Homes on Track, Part 2. First, I will provide some context on transit-oriented communities and the goals behind this project. Then I'll walk through how we evaluated opportunities in station areas across Connecticut and share some insights on existing conditions. Then I'll share the results of the analysis, our 3 scores that capture relative opportunity levels across the state. And I'll dive into some of our key findings, as well as our recommendations for how the state and local communities can use this report to advance transit-oriented growth. Transit-oriented communities, or TOCs, an acronym I'll be using a lot today, so bear with me, are places where people live near trains and buses in walkable neighborhoods where they can easily get to where they need to go without relying on a car. TOCs address several problems at once. They help increase the housing supply in places with existing infrastructure, lower transportation costs for families, reduce traffic and pollution, and make public transit work better by giving it more riders. The report looks at where the state and municipalities should prioritize investments and zoning changes for transit-oriented communities by ranking station areas in Connecticut by relative level of opportunity. And we really hope that the results will be a practical resource and a way to advance the conversation around transit-oriented communities in the state. So what are our key findings? Our report breaks opportunities down by near-term, midterm, and long-term potential. And we found that there are 19 stations ready to become transit-oriented communities in the near term with the right investments, and that these stations are really concentrated around the state's oldest and largest cities, which act as regional economic hubs. We also found that Connecticut station areas have a lot of underutilized land, which holds opportunities for new development. And lastly, we found that two corridors in particular hold great potential for TOCs. The first is along the CT Fast Track Corridor, which is the state's only current rapid bus system and runs between downtown New Britain and central Hartford. And the second is in the Naugatuck Valley along the Waterbury branch line, where we believe that the right major investments can unlock that region's full potential. We will dive into these key findings a bit deeper later in the presentation. For this study, we looked at the conditions inside a half-mile radius of all of Connecticut's commuter rail and rapid bus stations. There are 36 of them across 7 planning regions, or COGs. What we found is that some of the most walkable station areas in Connecticut are in Mystic, Windsor, Riverside and Greenwich, and Wallingford, each averaging about a walk of just over 7.5 minutes to get from the station to anywhere inside the station area. Average walk times to the station are shorter in places with smaller blocks and more uniform street grids, like New Haven State Street here on the right side of the slide, and longer in places with suburban cul-de-sac-like streets, like the Merritt 7 station area in Norwalk here on the left. Assuming a 1-hour commute time via transit and walking, people who live inside the station areas in the capital region have access to the most jobs of anyone in the state. They have access to about 278,000 jobs on average via an hour of transit, accounting for headways. Places with a greater mix of land uses are generally better suited to become successful transit-oriented communities in the near term. Greater Bridgeport, also known as MetroCog, and Southeastern Connecticut are the 2 planning regions with the highest concentration of diverse land use inside their station areas. So residential densities of about 7 to 8 homes an acre are needed to support successful local bus service in the community, but densities are relatively low across the state, even inside the station areas. We found that residential densities inside station areas range from less than 1 home per acre, like at Branchville in Ridgefield, on the left side of the slide, to 10 or even 15 homes per acre at some of our most urban stations, like Stamford on the right. We also wanted to understand how much underutilized land there is inside each station area that could then be used for potential development. So for this, we looked at 2 variables. We looked at vacant land classified as undeveloped lots with no use, and unbuilt lot cover, or the area of a lot that is not covered by buildings or structures. And what we found is that the Naugatuck Valley region has the greatest opportunity for ground-up development statewide. Sewer connectivity is critical for denser neighborhoods, and we found that it is in fact highly accessible in 51 of the state's 63 station areas. 9 station areas have no sewer access in Connecticut. That's Westbrook, Clinton, Old Saybrook, Madison, Branchville and Ridgefield, Cannondale and Wilton, Greens Farms in Westport, and Reading. There are also just 9 station areas that have more than 1/5 of their land inside the FEMA 100-year floodplain. That is Cannondale and Wilton again, Bethel, Old Greenwich, New Haven, Union Station, Branford, Mystic, Guilford, Windsor, and Berlin. And when we took a look at recent housing growth as a way to predict market demand inside station areas, we found that the regions of Southeastern Connecticut and Western Connecticut had the highest average housing growth rates. So All of the variables that we've just looked at were chosen to capture growth potential on the one hand and transit supportiveness on the other inside a given station area. We gave each station area a score based on how their characteristics ranked against the other areas in Connecticut. That score is made up of these two components, transit orientation and potential development, which are really ways to group together the variables relating to built form, mobility, environment, underutilized land, and growth rates that we've just gone through together. And having these two poles allowed us to capture a type of balance between how supportive the existing conditions are for transit and how much potential exists for future development. It's really important the scores are ranking relative only to stations inside Connecticut, not relative to another state in the region or anywhere else, so that they can help policymakers in the state make decisions on where to prioritize investment and support. These final scores classify the station areas by 3 levels of relative opportunity, either in the near term, midterm, or long term. And we call these 3 categories TOC types. Near-term station areas are the most ready to support transit-oriented communities, but may still require modest investments to encourage additional development. And then midterm station areas have strong potential, but often need more significant public investments like a connected street grid or more frequent transit. And last, but definitely not least, long-term stations face more fundamental constraints and will require sustained planning and investments over time, like sewer infrastructure or flood mitigation, before they can fully support transit-oriented communities. I do just want to highlight our little asterisk on the slide here, which is to say that our framework can't capture local factors like community support or strong developer interest that can really influence how quickly opportunities can be realized. Every station area is unique, but our opportunity scores can help decision makers understand how, where, and at what level to deploy resources. 19 station areas come out as near-term opportunities, which, as you can see on the map, are concentrated around Connecticut's largest cities, including Stamford, Hartford, New Haven, Norwalk, and Danbury. I really want to highlight this pattern we found, which is that the distribution of TOC types across Connecticut reflects the state's multiple regional centers and downtowns. So rather than a single dominant center or being pulled by Manhattan Central Business District outside the state, Connecticut has multiple long-established downtowns and urban areas that act as employment hubs and regional anchors for the state. And that pattern is reflected in the TOC types from our analysis. And to us, this underscores an opportunity in Connecticut to think about transit in the future, not only as a way to connect people to Manhattan, as has historically been the case, but also as a network that supports connections between Connecticut's own communities, jobs, and regional centers. Despite these urban anchors, stations across the state do span the full range of TOC types, which tells us that there is potential to support transit-oriented communities in both larger cities and smaller communities. There are also near or midterm opportunities in all 7 COGs that have rapid transit. And here, I just wanted to provide the full list of stations categorized by each TOC type. I won't walk through each station individually, but this can serve as a reference for anyone interested in specific locations or follow-up discussions. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted online afterwards, or we encourage you to get in touch with us to learn more about your particular station area. I'd now like to dig a bit deeper into some of the other key findings I mentioned at the top of the presentation. Single-family homes in Connecticut cover 91% of residential land around stations, leaving us roughly 15,150 acres underutilized and 42% of transit zone homes without sufficient density for bus service. For reference, that 15,150 acres is an area bigger than the size of New Haven. That tells us that there is significant opportunity for future development in places where infrastructure and market conditions can support additional growth. Station areas running between downtown New Britain and central Hartford offer enormous potential for supporting transit-oriented communities in the near and midterm. These stations run along the CT Fast Track corridor, Connecticut's only bus rapid transit system. Residential densities in these areas are still relatively low, certainly lower than is desired to support express bus service. That's likely due to the relative age of the system, which opened only 11 years ago, compared to our rail corridors, right, that have shaped development patterns for much longer. The Naugatuck Valley has the highest proportion of near and midterm opportunities of all regions across Connecticut. The region also has a relatively significant amount of underutilized land. So with the right major investments to significantly improve service on the Waterbury branch line and other targeted support, the corridor is really well positioned to support transit-oriented communities. So we know that Connecticut has many station areas with the potential to support transit-oriented communities, but realizing that potential will require coordinated action at both the state and local levels. At the state level, Connecticut should establish a data-driven approach to prioritizing opportunities. They should align investments across state agencies. They should focus resources on high opportunity station areas, and they should improve the data needed to support this kind of complex decision-making. The state will also need to address barriers that would limit development in these communities. That includes zoning and permitting reforms, expanding affordable housing opportunities, and making improvements to transit access. At the local level, we hope that this report can be used as a starting point for communities to better understand the opportunities and challenges inside their station areas and identify next steps. So if you're watching this and you live or work in one of these 63 station areas, we encourage you to get in touch with us for a more in-depth conversation about your particular station area. We also encourage you to get in touch with the Connecticut Municipal Development Authority, CMDA, to learn about how you can partner and access resources to support local efforts. And later in the discussion, we'll also talk a bit more about how some of these opportunity scores can help the state work through implementation of the new law, PA 25-1. And lastly, we hope that this decision-making framework can be a useful guide to translate the TOC types into potential actions where we can see the types of investments, infrastructure improvements, and policy changes that may be appropriate based on each station area's TOC type, where we move from really targeted regulatory and placemaking changes towards larger infrastructure investments and more substantial planning efforts as we move from near-term to longer-term opportunities. And as I close out my presentation, I really hope that we've been able to provide you with some valuable insights today that you can take back to your work or your communities. And with that, I'm going to bring Pete back on.
Awesome. Thanks, Phoebe. And just really want to say you did such a great job with this report. This has been a long time in the hopper, and we're just really excited about what you and Marcel put together. So thanks so much for a great job on the report. As Phoebe mentioned, we're going to bring in Marcel Negrete, RPA's Land Use Director, who also worked on this report in part one. And we're going to bring in Nick Cantor, the Programs Director for ProHomes Connecticut, which of course is a program of RPA, to talk a little bit about some of the details of the methodology and findings, to talk about the regional context of this report, and then to talk about what we want to do with this report with a lot of partners on this call. So Phoebe, I just wanted to follow up, and I don't want to spoil a question that's going to come in the Q&A from the audience that I saw already. But obviously the transit side of this is a key part. We know the state has been doing investments, particularly in some of the branch lines. The governor just had a big announcement on improving the New Haven line again. But I wanted to ask, just to clarify for folks, what amount of transit service, where was that factored in the report? And then also, I think you had a kind of a key finding of the difference between our historical thought of rail gets people to Manhattan and thinking more about the opportunities for intrastate rail. So just want you to weigh in on those two questions.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's really important. So we were able to capture frequency of transit or headways by looking at that jobs metric that I talked about. So by looking at how many jobs are accessible within a 1 hour commute time, that 1 hour commute time is via walking, bus, and rail. And that variable specifically allows us to include the frequency at which trains are arriving. And then the second part of the question, which was about intracity, the future of intracity transit. I think that's really important. I think that a lot of times there's this expectation that the point of the rail system is to get people to and from job opportunities in Manhattan Central Business District. But what we see is that there's a lot of economic opportunity in Connecticut, right? And we see that there are a few really economic hubs throughout the regions that we should be connecting more people to. And because of this 1 hour commute time, in fact, of course, there are lots of job opportunities in the Central Business District in Manhattan. But what we're finding is that if we're looking at this 1 hour commute time, there are a lot of opportunities in Connecticut that we haven't yet fully reached the potential of.
Yeah, and I think that checks out. We've had a number of conversations with folks, particularly in Fairfield County, saying that the pre-COVID 9 to 5 commuter to Central Business District in Manhattan has not really rebounded, although ridership on branch lines off peak times has rebounded, or in some cases for the Waterbury or Hartford line actually surpassed pre-COVID numbers. So I think that was certainly one of our key findings, that rather than trying to think about even the rail service as a way to get to the city, we can think about, people getting on in Naugatuck, going up to Waterbury to catch a show at the theater or otherwise. And that's a really exciting opportunity and certainly factored into some of this analysis. I want to kind of expand out to the regional view and bring in Marcel, who worked on this report and also part one. And folks might remember from the YIMBYtown panel where we talked about the current conditions in Connecticut, some of this insight. But Marcel, I just want to ask you to provide both a regional context of what TOCs mean in terms of the region and these kind of further fields of CBDs, but also to really give a Connecticut audience a sense of what is unique about Connecticut relative to New Jersey and New York in terms of opportunities for our rail stations.
Thank you, Pete. Yeah, so let me mention, I think, two different things. I guess I'll start with the more positive type of finding that makes Connecticut stand out. And Phoebe presented that she mentioned that only 9 out of the 63 stations face high flood exposure based on the 100-year floodplain from FEMA. That's roughly 15% of the stations that we analyzed, and that's a fairly lower number compared to other parts of the tri-state region. And we've also said, and this is particularly true in the context of Connecticut, that TOCs offer a viable alternative for the state to adapt to climate change and the growing impacts that are coming from that in terms of flooding. Most of the housing stock in Connecticut is not affected by high flood risk areas. Approximately 660,000 units are located within the transit zone and in low flood risk areas. So they're not exposed to that high risk flood hazards. So that's like generally good news. It reinforces that in the context of Connecticut, TOCs are in fact a viable climate change adaptation measure. Having said that, there are some locations within these corridors, especially those facing the Long Island Sound, that will require some additional funding and planning efforts to minimize flood risk. But these again represent generally a minority of the stations and the housing stock overall. So that's and when you compare to these same figures compared to Long Island or Northern New Jersey, yeah, you see that a much higher percentage of the stations and the overall housing stock is in fact affected by flood risk. So that's like a general, positive thing that would stand out. Now, the second thing that I wanted to mention, and it relates to um, how we analyzed and measured residential density in relation to access to jobs and proximity to the central business district. So what residential densities across the tri-state area show a great range of diversity in terms of their density. In some cases, ranging from one or two dwelling units per acre in some of the outskirts of the tri-state region to hundreds of units per acre in some stations in New York City or in the urban core. Uh, and what we see is that typically this density increases considerably with better access to jobs and shorter travel times to the central business district, especially for stations that have a travel time within an hour or less to the central business district. So that correlation between density and travel time is pretty strong within that first hour of commuting. In New Jersey's metro core, northern New Jersey, when we measure this as a correlation coefficient, this is a correlation that is six times stronger than what we see in the stations on Long Island or in Southwest Connecticut. Um, so this suggests that residential density in New Jersey is more strongly influenced by job access and proximity to Manhattan, while stations in Long Island and in southwestern Connecticut tend to maintain relatively low densities regardless of that job accessibility. And that's not such a great thing to be in or to have because it's showing the data alignment that we're trying to pursue between land use and where you have transit is not there yet in the context of Connecticut. Like this is at least when you measure it based on the build form and density, it will be interesting to see in a decade or two when we've had enough time to see the reforms to shape the build form in some of these places to see if that metric has changed in a substantial way, which I think will be a useful way to measure progress. And so I think this relation between density and travel time and job access is a key metric that we want to continue to keep track on.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction. I mean, we made subtle differences between the three states, so it's not necessarily an apples to apples. So for folks referencing part one, a midterm opportunity in New Jersey is not necessarily the same variables and metric as a midterm opportunity in Connecticut or Long Island. But I think, yeah, it does speak to, I think, two things. And one, obviously, Marcel, we talked about with Phoebe of just how to think about that intra-city multipolar job commute times in Connecticut as an opportunity, but also how important it is to get faster train times on particularly the New Haven line. And there's efforts to cut down that 25 to 30 minutes in the next few years can in addition to zoning reforms, motivate a lot of the changes that we want to see, which I think is really important. And just remind me, so we said 60 minutes for Connecticut, but was it, I think, 45 minutes in New Jersey, that commute time?
Yeah, correct. The first report, when we look at New Jersey, New York, we used first 45-minute as our main benchmark to measure job access. In the case of Connecticut, we realized that we wanted to increase it to try to capture to an extent possible the influence and southwestern portion of the state that still has in this central business district. So we wanted to capture some of that, which is why we decided to increase that number to an hour. But yeah, you're right to point that like Connecticut, based on that measurement, and based on maps and charts that Phoebe was presenting earlier, that shows the overlap that these places that we've identified have with the state's historic towns and centers and regional centers. And so that may not be a full surprise, but it's interesting to show that alignment. And again, like because this is a framework that's intended to think about the policy and the decisions that are being made at the state level, and what is the state doing to support this alignment between land use and transit. I think that's another reason for us to decide to kind of build the scoring system in the way that we did. We're mainly a key stakeholder. We realize a key stakeholder here is the state and the COGS and the many localities. So we wanted to make sure that it was something that was representing the potential degree of influence that these stakeholders could have in the state.
Yeah, I appreciate that context. And again, as a reminder for the audience, that it's not apples to apples between a station in New York or New Jersey. It's relative opportunity compared to the stations in Connecticut. And Phoebe, I just want to come back to a little bit about the methodology. So you referenced this a little bit about how, by definition, we're not going to capture everything happening on the ground. There obviously are nuances, but could you talk a little bit about that? What were some variables or potentially even timelines of data that we just haven't captured here?
Yeah, definitely. So you're right. There were a bunch of things that we just couldn't capture in the scoring system. Some of those would be like housing permitting data, how that's changed recently, local buy-in. I think there are, for instance, a few examples of places where there's a lot of local enthusiasm for transit-oriented development, even as long-term stations, and they're committed to working through some of the challenges that they have ahead of them. Wilton is one of them that comes to mind. And then we also don't include ridership numbers, even though we do measure headways. And then I guess the other thing that I would mention, because I think I saw something about it in the questions that have come in, is that this report also has to be, as is the nature of data, a snapshot in time, right? So this captures the data that we were working with, and would be data as of 2025. And so that means that, for instance, if there has been a bunch of projects approved at the beginning of 2026, then that wouldn't be captured in these numbers, right? And it also means that I think there'll be some changes. We've talked a lot about how much opportunity there is in the Naugatuck Valley, but I'm curious how the numbers would change even more to reflect that, with some of the changes some of the service improvements that they're doing on the Waterbury branch line at the moment. They're also moving some of those stations to get them closer to the sort of downtown core. And I think that those plans that are already in the works will only increase the potential in some of those areas.
Yeah, it's an important metric of Windsor Locks comes to mind, Naugatuck comes to mind, where new stations are in the works, and we haven't captured that yet. So it won't really change much of those scoring for those particular cases, but there's a little bit of nuance there. I want to bring in Nick now, and I kick this off by talking about, we want this to be a reference for helping implement Public Act 25-1. There's a lot going on at the state level and the COG level right now. Local communities are obviously asking questions about this. But, Nick, broadly speaking, of course, with us supporting Work, Live, Ride as part of this, what takeaway should you have, or should you share with folks about implementing the housing growth program in the years ahead with this data, and how should municipalities particularly use this to think about how to plan for this type of growth?
Thanks, Pete. And I think what's most exciting about this report is giving local municipalities in the state a framework to think ambitiously. I think this, a lot of cases, people can be reserved and thinking and being creative. And I think this report starts to show what the potential could be in a lot of places across the state. And I think that's really exciting. And when we think about it more so in a couple of key audiences, one with the state and where prioritization should be, really growing state capacity, the Council on Housing Development. We're working with some of the working groups, obviously, there in CMDA, but in the Housing Growth Fund, there's a lot of potential there for state prioritization of seeing when housing and transit come aligned and that prioritization actually occurs, you can really have multiplier effects and really benefit the communities. At the local and COG levels, you know, there's a lot going on right now, whether that's understanding the state numbers that are coming down, which will then turn into state municipal allocation numbers, coming up with their housing growth plans, which are going to be due in 27 and 28, or even just considering opting into Work, Live, Ride. I think this data helps contextualize all the other data sources that are coming out there and hopefully simplifies some of it. There's a lot of data coming out to folks, and I think this report in a lot of ways can help synthesize all the different inputs as we're thinking about where people have the opportunity and where the state should focus its investments and prioritization.
Yeah, and you mentioned CMDA. We partnered with them for the current conditions report. They're currently working on a similar study, if my understanding is correct. And I think the hope is that a bunch of different folks working in very similar data sets and making some similar observations can really help solidify how important TOCs particularly are. And we're really encouraged, obviously, the progress so far that CMDA has made. And, Pro-Homes Connecticut, we obviously want to support a lot of that work on the ground. In terms of, Phoebe has a slide at the end, like what a near-term, midterm, long-term kind of intervention looks like. So from the Pro-Homes Connecticut perspective, how do you see us using this report and prioritizing what communities you want to go? And you mentioned obviously opting in for Work, Live, Ride. So how do you think Pro-Homes Connecticut is going to take this and put this into action?
I think on a couple of levels there. First is definitely what towns are most eligible to opt into Work, Live, Ride, whether or not there could be potentially grandfathered, whether or not they're actually pretty good zoning already exists and they don't have a lot of changes that needs to happen. The state's still working through what those requirements would be, and we're on the working group there. So I think that's really helpful to see where that, we're not on the working group, sorry. There is a working group within the Council of Housing Development focusing on that. So that'll be really important. And then as we think of where else I think would be really helpful, this report is going to be used to sort of, what's the next layer of targets after that? It's obvious if you already have a TOD and working it, opting into Work, Live, Ride as in the grandfathered path is one path, but towns can opt into it otherwise and unlock that funding that we're hopeful for the Housing Growth Fund, which should be substantial, as we're being told it's going to be substantial. So that will, I think, help guide us in where to prioritize time, energy, and effort, because we can't go after 169 communities at once.
Yeah, I mean, and a not so subtle audience for this is at the state level, and if the Council on Housing Development making strong recommendations, getting that funding from the legislature and the governor next year, we want to create that type of incentive and clear carrot that if you're ambitious and smart putting these districts together, they're going to be quite a bit of resources together. And we'll just mention quickly before we get into the Q&A part, but the federal government, overwhelmingly bipartisan Road to 21st Century Housing passed. And although that is somewhat in a similar situation to 25-1, where there are really some great changes that will impact Connecticut, there isn't funding yet. But assuming that comes into place too, there's going to be quite a bit of syncing efforts at the federal and state level to provide municipalities and COGs with the resources, both just the funding dollars, but the technical assistance and flexibility. So it's really great timing that this report has come out in the wake of that passing in DC, because there's just a clear acknowledgement that transit-oriented development, transit-oriented communities has to be the central part of growth and conservation, not just in Connecticut, but across the country. So we're really encouraged by that, and obviously hope those things get funding. So we'll be working at both levels, certainly on our RPA side. I want to pivot now for the last 15 or 20 minutes. So, sorry, Marcel.
Can I add one very quick comment on like Nix's I think one reasoning that we made to classify the tiers as we did on a temporal sense, referring to them in near, mid, or long term, was to acknowledge that even if a community is categorized as long-term opportunity, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing anything there. It just means that the scope and the breadth of the planning work is going to be is going to take longer to implement. Like if you're in a locality that doesn't have a sewer, right? You don't have sewers, you have a street grid that's not conducive to walkability. It's just going to take longer to implement that. So it's just getting a sense of the timeline and the the scope. But that just to reinforce that if you're term, it doesn't mean that we're saying like we're not going to do anything there. It just means that the scope and breadth of the interventions will probably take like a much longer period of time than the ones that we classified as near term.
Yeah, and that's a very good segue to our Q&A. So I think one of the questions is just, will the slides be available? Absolutely. We'll make sure those get out as a follow-up. But the first question is actually about sewer capacity and what was that estimated or based on in terms of data? Phoebe, you might want to take a shot at that.
Yeah, this is an important distinction that I want to make. So our analysis looked at sewer connectivity, not sewer capacity. So we looked at where sewer infrastructure existed, but we were not able to capture how much capacity exists there. So that was not included in our analysis. I should have included that in that list I gave of some of the things that weren't in the analysis. And I believe that resource came from DEEP, a map of the sewer infrastructure across the state, and then we used that to analyze what portion of residential lots inside the station area were inside that sewer connectivity map.
Yeah, and Public Act 25-1 has a very big effort to collect data on capacity of existing sewer systems. That is an incredibly frustrating, slow process and speaks to kind of a lack of centralized data and a lot of the different aspects of this infrastructure. But I know Office of Responsible Growth is working on trying to understand that capacity. It's probably the most critical question in some cases, but this report is basically a binary where it currently exists or not. Next question is your assessment of the Naugatuck Valley region accounting for specific branch line improvements that are already in progress. I think Phoebe, you mentioned this a little bit if you just want to tie the bow on this one.
Yeah, that's right. So I would say that, any improvements that weren't made by the time that we pulled the data in the second half of 2025 are not included. And that means, for instance, that the original current, let's call them stations in the Naugatuck Valley are what we used for that half-mile radius, not the new locations, because we wanted to be sure that we were capturing what currently existed. Otherwise, you have this type of snowball effect when you try and capture all the type of progress that's currently being made while you try and get an analysis underway.
Yeah, and obviously we're not counting the fact that it's the Bustitute right now that the rail line is suspended as they're making some of those improvements and fixes from the big storm. But yeah, I mean, what's been great is the Waterbury branch line and the Hartford branch line ridership has surpassed pre-COVID numbers. So those investments, not surprisingly, are working. If you have better service, you're going to get more riders. That's going to attract more development. And, we certainly want to encourage the state to keep making those investments, but also coordinating more under Public Act 25-1, the Housing Growth Program.
Yeah, and I guess, Pete, I just want to add on one final point about the Naugatuck Valley and those new improvements, which is to say that increased frequencies on the Waterbury branch line would go a long way, because something that we found that I didn't mention in the presentation is that it was actually quite hard to capture all of the jobs available in the Waterbury area through that 1 hour commute time, even within the Waterbury branch line, because some of the headways were so long. So I just want to mention that even though we've talked about all the potential that already exists in that region, that if we could shorten commute times and get more folks up to all of the jobs that are available in that region, things, we would go even further.
And one thing we didn't study on this at all is local regional bus service. And that's something RPA is incredibly interested in. We think that's a significant portion of connectivity between a lot of these rail stations. So if anybody is interested in supporting research and analysis on the bus service in Connecticut, please let us know, because that's something we've been working on as a complement to this rail and rapid bus. Speaking of rapid bus, a question about the Move New Haven BRT. There are 4 lines being planned in some degree. What lessons do we have as we start building this new BRT infrastructure in New Haven, in terms of for zoning, land use, airport linkage, et cetera? I don't know, Marcel, you want to take a shot at that?
Well, I think it is important to start thinking about land use as you're starting to figure out what the infrastructure of this new BRT is going to look like. Being proactive about the land use, I think in general, would be a good move. And some other examples in our region, I think, support that. It's If you delay it, I think there are challenges to uh, associated perhaps with land speculation, and then making it harder to then make enacted changes that would be conducive to a more transit oriented type of planning approach. So I think the earlier the better, in general terms, to try to see where those alignments could be made. Um, yeah, that's like very high level, but get started on thinking about what the potential land use should be for that corridor.
Yeah, we're really excited about the BRT New Haven. We've done some walk audits in Hamden already. We're going to do some upcoming in New Haven, which we'll talk about at the end here. So if you're interested in that, so are we, and we're going to be working with the city of New Haven and Hamden and some of the other areas about this. And obviously, that's not to exclude Fast Track East from Manchester up to Stores, which we're also interested in. So we're not going to be building new rail infrastructure. We can improve existing service, but we can build new bus service, and that's certainly something we want to talk more about. Another question for the 19 station areas in the near term: what do the private sector and each scale of government need to do to rapidly unlock the dev for these sites for TOCs? I don't know if Nick, you want to take a first shot?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing also in this report shows that, most stations are unique in what's needed in each community. There's not a one size fit all. So it's sort of like an impossible thing necessary, I would say, to say uh, of a panacea that's going to unlock everything. Obviously, one of the big factors here is land use, and making it easier to develop around the transit is the clear signal that I think comes from this. But Phoebe, Pete, if there's other things too, and Marcel too, feel free to hop in with other things you think are most glaring to you.
Yeah, opening up to anybody on that. I think a related question is also, have we seen, since the law passed last year, is there more willingness from towns that have historically been reluctant to approve more TODs, particularly on Metro North? I think these are related, that the public-private partnership is a key part of this. It may be a little bit too early to find out if the law is changing it. I think, there's some positives. I think also what we've always believed is that there are plenty of communities that are really interested, particularly in transit-oriented communities, and that pull of public resources and private partnership has been challenging, and streamlining state capacity to meet that is really important. But I'll throw it over to Phoebe.
I guess I wanted to get a little bit at this question of at the different scales of government, what do they need to be doing to rapidly unlock the development of sites in these near-term transit-oriented communities? And I would say a few things that are from that decision-making framework that are showed are really important. So at the local level, it's really important that the zoning regulations are such that multifamily and mixed use can be built at the scale and level that's appropriate for that community. There are also ways to speed up permitting processes to help the private sector build those homes and mixed use buildings that we're talking about. Oftentimes that is an extremely long process, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the process. And that really slows things down and makes it more expensive for the private developer. And then, as you go up the levels of government, when we get to the level of the state, it's really about making sure that the state has the municipality where the transit-oriented community is, has both the technical capacity support that it might need, and also that it has the types of funding and investments that are required to unlock what can happen in a transit-oriented community.
Yeah, Pete, and
And
oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead, Nick.
I was just say to go off what you were saying too is on, are people more open to the conversations now? I think I agree. It's too soon to tell. And the main carrot in PA 25-1 was the Housing Growth Fund, which has not been funded yet. So I think that's more evidence of needing the legislature and the governor to actually fund that at in a substantial way to move things along.
There's also a question of assuming Bridgeport, New Haven, and Hartford would be considered economic hubs, which they are. Why not focus on housing redevelopment to the scale that we have seen in Stamford in those cities? I think there are two questions. One is the methodology of the report, which I think, Phoebe, you can speak to, of counterintuitively, it doesn't necessarily prioritize some of the cities because they are built up. There are different levels of intervention. We obviously want to see a significant amount of growth in Bridgeport, New Haven, and Hartford. To some degree, that's happening in New Haven, and I think there's some great steps being taken to do more. Hartford has had some great work with the regional authority there. But yeah, it's a yes and. I think we all agree we want to see, frankly, the majority of the significant growth we anticipate the next 20 or 30 years in our cities. There's quite a bit of work that needs to be done on the infrastructure there, but we also do want to see in smart places like where there is rapid rail, where there should be some growth as well. But I think we agree with the premise. We want to see the cities absorbing and growing significantly. And I know Stamford and New Haven are in a fight to be, the fastest growing city or something like that, which is great. We want to see more of that. I think we're in a good position where the big cities in Hartford, Waterbury and Danbury I mentioned, are trying to do that. And we can obviously do more to help them. I know you had something to add, Phoebe, on that.
No, that's exactly it. I was going to say, to the question of why not focus on housing redevelopment, why not? I think that's an important piece of all of this, for sure, definitely.
Okay, so last couple minutes here, I want to try to get questions. Comparisons to Rhode Island. Let's see here. I guess is a question. So kind of related to this, have we seen any support or involvement from localities on adopting TOD policies and gaining funding? Is there a formal partnership with the state of Connecticut to offer technical assistance and this sort of opt-in? The exciting thing is there are things happening and aligning on this. We certainly have already talked about the CMDA, which is a public authority towns have been opting into. They're getting technical assistance, analysis, even gap financing in some cases. What our effort is with the Office of Responsible Growth is to streamline state agency support. And just as, an anecdotal example, DEEP has a whole permitting and brownfield process. And how do we sync up that they can do their work, expedite their reviews to unlock development rather than doing it piecemeal and being development driven? If it can be district driven, we can get the state to go into these districts, even without development being there yet, to say, here's what we need for improving a sidewalk from DOT or pedestrianizing. Here's what we need from DEEP to do an environmental review of development at a certain density or get brownfield funds. That's really early stages. But Work Live Ride was really conceived by talking at the local level in communities that are already trying to do transit-oriented communities and where the barriers on the private sector, public, local sector. And a lot of it does come down to what Nick has mentioned and Phoebe's mentioned is, can the state be a really coherent quarterback for investment, for support? All the money to some degree is there. We need more funding for the housing growth program, certainly to Nick's point, but the state does have a lot of resources to be able to deploy. We just want to see it more strategically placed and more streamlined. And those efforts at least are ongoing. And obviously the COGS will play a kind of a new role in this. And I think there's a question of capacity and there, but things are moving in the right direction, I would say, but it's still pretty early. Okay, we do have some questions. To clarify, we are not in charge of state development. I'm not even sure we would want to be in charge of that, but this report is certainly just an advocacy resource. But we do know that certainly a lot of local communities, a lot of COGs, a lot of the state government are really motivated by transit-oriented communities, and I think that will continue, and we really applaud those efforts and obviously want to support where we can. I guess final question is, how is the Housing Growth Fund being capitalized, new tax levy or appropriation? That remains to be seen. Our understanding is I think it will be bonding as opposed to appropriations. I think, the best case scenario would be that the Housing Growth Program, which there is bonding capacity at the state level, gets a nice chunk of money and a really clear runway of what communities need to do to get the most of that funding. It's opting into Work, Live, Ride, opting into CMDA, being ambitious in those plans. I think that's really already in the works. We'd love to see the other state funding. Similarly, it kind of already is supposed to be prioritized in certain places, but have the state have a more coherent ROI and partnership level, and where would an investment in improving sewer capacity in town A versus city B look? We need that level of data sophistication at the state level. And then, as I mentioned, if road 21st century federal funding comes through in the next cycle, that could just be a significant transformative amount of money to reward communities already doing what we want to see under the Housing Growth Plan. So it's not guaranteed yet. We're going to keep advocating and really want support from everybody to keep advocating at the state and federal levels. But there at least is a really significant opportunity, really once in a generation, to support communities that already want to do this work, to do it really well and do it quickly. And that's very exciting. Okay, so I think that brings us right to 11 o'clock. So I want to thank all of you again for participating in this event release. It is now up on the website. I think we put it in, I think, in the chat already. Thanks again, Marcel and Phoebe and Nick, for the discussion. And if you're interested in learning more about this, please contact us. We're really excited to be partnering at all levels of government going forward to implement this. But thanks again, and stay dry.